Here we are. Thanks, Gail, for the presentation, the introduction, and for the invitation. I feel a bit conscripted to this presentation from my fellow colleagues in the university because technically Stuart Pryor is the director of this project, but I was involved in the excavations. Now, it's interesting, I don't know how many of you joined us last year when we were very excitedly I was talking to you about our new venture in the department that we're going to be excavating in the Lower Hazel, a fantastic medieval site in South Gloucestershire, just 20 minutes north of Bristol, close to Alveston. However, COVID and other difficulties will delay this Lower Hazel project, hopefully for next summer. And since we are in a tidy up kind of mentality at the moment of the department, trying to close old projects that we have opened and we have pretty much abandoned for several reasons, we said it may be a good idea to return to the Royal Fort and to the Royal Fort Gardens, which technically is our backyard. So until last minute, we didn't even know if we were going to be able to excavate there because, of course, we couldn't congregate people even in outside spaces. However, if you remember, government restrictions lifted in May and we'll be allowed to take our students and put a spade in Royal Fort. As you probably already know, we are not the first to do this. The area of Royal Fort has been significantly researched the last 20 years or so. The university, our department in 2001 started and did some excavation in front of the physics building. Now, if you do not know the campus, but you've been to the Royal Fort, as you're going into the gate to the Royal Fort Gardens, physics building is the massive building on your left as you're going into the gardens. Then the next season, the university put a couple of trenches. When they put the mirror maze, the university, our department again did a small excavation where the mirror maze is. And towards the mid of the first decade of the 21st century, the Barras, the commercial unit of the Bristol Museum, has been excavated, the area that is now the new bioscience building of the university. So it was lots of research already happening in Royal Fort. Now, unfortunately, minus a paper from Barras that came out of the results of their excavation, the material of this research, all the 20 years research, hasn't been studied and published properly. So in reality, if we have an idea about the topography of the space and what's going on, we don't really know all the little details and all this information that some can derive from archaeological finds. Now, I can tell you what we've done this year in Bristol, and I can tell you pretty much in Royal Fort, and I can tell you pretty much what our colleagues previously did on Royal Fort. But since it's a project on the very beginning, tidying up the old excavation and producing a comprehensive account of the narrative, of the biography of the St. Michael's Hill Fort, in reality, I cannot tell you too much because we don't know yet. It's a journey that just started, at least for me. Now, I have to make a massive disclaimer here for your questions at the end, which I did last year when I was presenting Lower Hazel. I'm not a medieval archaeologist and neither a post-medieval archaeologist. I'm a Southeast European prehistorian. So if you have any very tricky question, I might have to ask you to send your question to Dr. Stuart Pryor at the department. But I was there for the excavations. I was co-directing with him. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you a kind of a journal of what we did, how we did it, why we did it, and what's our first results. Now, I wasn't sure if you know exactly the history of the Royal Fort and why it's interesting and why it's complex. So the first two slides is going to be a brief account. First of all, we don't know a lot of things about St. Michael's Hill before the Civil War. it was an estate, that it was being given to a nabbi at the 14th century, but we don't have any actual archaeological information about these pre-Civil War periods. And even we don't know anything about any Roman, Anglo-Saxon, prehistoric presence on St. Michael's Hill. So all these are massive big question marks. It seems like the known history of St. Michael's Hill begins with the Civil War. So this was a question for our research now on St. Michael's Hills and on the Royal Fort. What's going on before the Civil War defenses? However, at the beginning of the outbreak of the war, the city of Bristol attempted to become neutral. However, a couple of weeks after London fell, it's been occupied by Colonel Thomas Essex's army. Colonel Thomas, what he tried to do once he occupied the city is to start building some defenses, particularly on the northwest, because River Avon was from the south. Second question mark here, we don't really know much about his defenses. There was some excavations, again, by the Department of Archaeology in Brandon's Hill, and there is the excavator believed that they actually clipped and discovered evidence for these early fortifications of 1643. But again, even this material hasn't been studied properly to date, so we don't really know. But we'll have to come with his account. Later, the tides changed in the war. The royalists starting advancing, reclaiming parts of the country back. King Charles' nephew, Prince Rupert, of the Rhine, moved his troops north of Bristol, and on the 23rd, Clifton Church fell to Royalist dragoons under Colonel Washington, and then Colonel Washington, from his position, launched his attack against Essex Works on Brandon Hill. Before the end of both Windmill Fort, which was the first name of the Parliamentarians' fort at St. Michael's Hills, fell, as the Essex Works. Shortly after recapturing the city, Prince Rupert ordered Bernard Gome to strengthen the fortifications and to create a great fort on St. Michael's Hill. It's the Royal Fort we call today. I suppose you've heard of the Gome. He's not that famous as Cromwell or Rupert or Charles, but he left a mark on 17th century Britain, because most of the defenses, royalist defenses built in this period, is actually built by the Gome. And of course, Prince Rupert conscripted all the Bristol residents to, not all, but like many of Bristol residents, to give him a hand to build back the fort. And by end of 1644, the fort was pretty much ready. However, less than about a year later, with a sweep attack, the New Model Army, actually under Fairfax and Cromwell himself, in pretty much all-out assault on the 10th of September of 1645, they pushed Prince Rupert to surrender. It's interesting how a very well-fortified area is actually fell so easily. So today, what we're looking to find out in this hill, we don't really know, because Cromwell decommissioned the fort pretty much after he captured it, and he ordered his demolishment. We don't know the extent of the defenses and their complexity. We don't have a clear account of the occupation of the hill prior to Civil War, as I was telling to you. And the next step in Royal Fort's history is Tyndall's estate. And Tyndall got Repton to actually re-landscape his estate. So Repton been invited by Tyndall, and he did all these massive re-landscaping works, the rolling hills that we still can enjoy in Royal Fort. So what we did this year then, since the backside of Tyndall's house has been excavated by Barras and in front of the physics building, so as you go in, as I said, to the Royal Fort, the area on your left has been excavated by the university. We focused on an area that hasn't been researched before, the area to an extent south of the Tyndall house. So we did some geophysical research, some magnetometry. The most prominent features, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor on the screen, but on the south of the picture here, on the bottom, is probably flower beds by Repton's landscaping. So end of 19th century landscaping, end of 18th, beginning of 19th century landscaping. But you can possibly see a faint line, like a white line that comes down into this geophysics picture and then turns up to the west. And we're starting thinking this may well be part of the fortification. So in order to see if this is correct, this assumption, we put down 3 trenches, a larger trench 1 at the north side of the area, a smaller trench 2 that tried to clip exactly these potential flower beds, but also that line that you can see here on the geophysics. Can you see my cursor actually? So when I'm pointing to you.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, perfect. So we have this white line. So the trench 2 was here, trench 1 was up here to actually try to see the continuation of the line to the north and also to explore these flower beds. Now, Kate Isles made them probably a great discovery while we were excavating from the Bristol Museum. Discovered they're quite lost because we couldn't find it for years. Red Book of Repton's regarding Tyndall's estate. So Repton, as a very good professional he was creating a little book with illustrations for his customers about how the area was and how the area would be after his landscaping. And we looked pretty much in every library in Britain and we couldn't find it. And then Kate discovered it. I think Kate in Harvard. Which library in the US you found this? You found it digitized?
I think it's,
what? Sorry?
I think it's Yale.
Yale, not Harvard. So on real-time communication with Bristol Museums, we received the digitized version. We print it out, and we've seen that an illustration that I'm going to show to you before, there's a part of wall surviving. And the part of wall surviving was quite aligned with this part of wall surviving at the back of the bush here. If you go on Royal Fort, there's a bend in front. So trench 3 was put it there in order to explore the extent of this wall. Now you can see our 3 trenches from this aerial imaging. A little bit better here, a little bit better from our results. I'm afraid I couldn't find a better picture for trench 3, but here we managed to identify these flower beds. You can see them here, this dark soil, and they look like 19th century flower beds. So these are probably parts of the Repton's landscaping. The most interesting stuff is that we can actually clip this white line, and it's a massive ditch, and is an earthen bank and a ditch that dips to the outside and actually follows the slope. And that kind of bank and ditch follows this white line in the geophysics. Interestingly, if you see that aerial imaging, you'll see that the grass here is what is a bit fainted. Of course, here becomes more because we're stepping on it, but you can see that line as it appeared in the geophysics and goes to the north. Another interesting fact from Trench 1 is these areas here of coring. Now, you may have heard that famous phrase that Bristol Cellars has been built by St. Michael's stone. So we believe that this was actually stone being robbed by buildings and by the royal fort itself. Actually, there was some extensive quarrying activity on Royal Fort, on St. Michael's Hill. And now we have some evidence to prove it from the excavation. Another interesting thing that appeared on Trench 1 is that liner, stone-packed liner, that potentially can be a ditch. There is some post-Civil War material in there, so it's been filled up after the Civil War. We don't really know yet if this is part of fortifications or not. But so it's open to discussion. Talking a little bit more about the quarrying, we have a large amount of clay pipes that all dated pre-Repton landscaping the area, but post-Civil War, so it's all about in the 18th century. And we have some, they can easily be dated because we've got stamps on them. And our perception, because we found these are the area of quarrying, we believe that these were the clay pipes of the quarrymen. And it's very interesting to see, you see the outcrops here in the picture of limestone. These outcrops is actually living under the turf. So once you take the turf out, the limestone outcrops, the quarried limestone outcrops, they are very visible. And then there were finds, pottery, and oyster cells, which used to be the workers' lands back in the day, but also clay pipes and clay pipe stems. Too many of them, actually. So we don't talk about too many from a very small slot, excavation slot. So I think there was a very extensive activity on the hill regarding quarrying. That's the illustration from Repton's Red Book. You'll see that wall. So we know that Repton has filled up this bit here. In the Barras excavations, they didn't find any stone-dressed walls. So the idea was that there was no stone-dressed walls in the Royal Fort of Bristol. Also, they identify the fort as very simple in terms of one massive ditch and an earthen rampart. Following de Gomes' description about the fort, it doesn't seem that it was that simple. De Gomes, it actually describes a complex fort, a very powerful fort that was Prince Rupert's headquarters for the area, statement for the area. The current excavations shows a different pictures. So we excavated actually the wall behind the bush to a depth of 1.70 meters, and the wall continues down and is massive. It's more than 1 meter thick. And we also have, seen behind the wall, the ditch, the one that has been excavated. And then behind the ditch, we have evidence of a bank. So it seems that the fortifications of the walls were way more complex than prominent. And remember, we've been excavating south of Tyndall House. So we're excavating the part of the fort that was really facing the city and not the open countryside. This is not an accurate depiction of how the fortifications should be. It's from Richard Israel's MPhil. Richard Israel did an MPhil about the Royal Fort, which is freely available to download and read, and he's really informative. So Richard Israel actually put the seed who says, like, it shouldn't be that simple, it should be more complex. And these current excavations actually showcasing a more complex perception about the fortification in the Royal Fort, and actually a series of walls, ditches and earth banks, and stone-dressed walls, evidence for stone-dressed walls. Now, I have overlaid here the Barras. This is a very kind of quick idea of how the fort was laid. This is from illustrations about the fort. This is the Barras excavation, from the Barras excavation reports. You can see the ditch here and the big long building that they found in the magazine of the fort. This is the gatehouse, which is still in place and you can visit. It's the only part of the fort that to an extent survives. It's been rebuilt and extended, but you can still see the original halls of the original gatehouse. And the Barras report was suggesting that this southern bit of the fort was actually going across Tyndall's house. Now we believe that actually what we were excavating here was this southern bastion of the fort. This shouldn't, I mean, because we know that the fortifications were going out that way and then this way to meet the Brandon Hill fort, we're not sure if this area has been attacked. But the sequence of walls and ditches, it seems that it actually follows this plan. So the fort was actually larger than we initially believed. And some preliminary results. I think I'm up on my time. Some preliminary results. So the actual fort, the second fort, the royal fort, is I don't know why I wrote it that way. The actual fort is actually larger. Anyway, my fault. My dyslexia. It's actually larger than was believed before. So we and for this we are now very confident. We have this evidence of quarrying in St. Michael's Hill. We found some Tudor pottery that showcases presence on the hill before the Civil War period. Unfortunately, we didn't have the chance, the time, because that was a student excavation and just under 3 weeks to go below the Civil War layers. But on the bank, on that Civil War bank that we cut through, there was some Tudor pottery there. So when they actually did the landscaping during Civil War in order to make the fort, either the Parliamentarian fort or the Royal fort, they sifted some Tudor pottery into that banks. And that pottery, it's actually good quality pottery. So the story of the fort, the story of the hill is actually older and bigger than we believed. Finally, another thing that we are very confident now, even more confident than the other three results, is that the fortifications are way more complex than we initially believed. And we are pretty confident that they were stone-dressed walls. Now we have to study the material. Now we have to see again the excavation results. I flee to a different project straight at the end of the excavation, so I didn't have time even myself to have a look at the records and think. But we are confident that if we bring together the Barras excavation dataset, the first University of Bristol dataset, and our research and potentially do a little bit more geophysics, we will be able to tell the complete narrative of St. Michael's Hill in the Civil War. And it's going to be a window open of what's going on before the war on St. Michael's Hill to be researched in the future.